So let me just begin and welcome everyone to the final 2022 Regents Cup competition for storytelling. You know, we're all excited to be here. My name is Paul Luna. I'm the President and CEO of Helios Education Foundation, and I know for me it's been an honor to be with all of you here today, serving as a judge. I'd like to just take a quick moment and briefly thank all of the judges who were here today, and I know it's been so difficult having to score such incredible talent that we see from all of our universities. I do want to please give a round of applause to all of our judges. Please raise your hand if you're a judge. I do want to thank also the Board of Regents, the ABOR staff, Sarah Harper. This has just been incredible what you put together and your support of us. So let's give them a round of applause. So we're here for the finals of our storytelling. It's been a journey to get here. So before we get there, I do want to also just say let's also recognize every single student that has competed today. Because you know every student, you could tell, put time, energy, effort, and so much into this. And obviously not every student gets to make it to the finals. But they did such great work, and it made our job as judges so difficult. So let's give all of our students a round of applause. Somebody else smarter than me earlier today said, you know, the future of Arizona is in great hands, as evidenced by the students that we see today. Their thoughtfulness, their intellect, their passion for debate, for civic discourse, you know, makes us all, I know, feel really, really good. But let's get on to the business at hand. So today we're going to have the finals of the storytelling, and the prompt for the students that they will discuss today is how democracy has influenced my life. In this round, we will hear from two speakers, the two final candidates. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak. The order of the speakers today will be first Celeste Lugo, and then Rachel Hodges. We're going to have a little bit of a cat fight because they're both from the University of Arizona, so friendly fight. But we're going to hear from two great speakers today. But before that, I'd like to introduce our judges, the tough job of this evening. I want to begin with Jay Richardson, who is the DE&I specialist from WL Board Associates up here in Flagstaff. Art Hamilton, I'm sorry. Don Wallace, the Vice President from the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership from the Flynn Foundation. We're excited, Don. Jim Romer, the Director and State Chief Information Security Officer for the Arizona Department of Homeland Security. Cynthia Dansek probably came from the longest distance, I believe, a professor at St. Lawrence University. Welcome. And Stephen Richard, the Maricopa County Recorder, Maricopa County Recorder's Office. That's our judges, as we thank all of our judges. So the way this will work is at the end of each student's storytelling presentation, the judges will have 8 minutes to submit their scores, so we'll give them a little bit of time between the speakers. And as we always remind our judges, you know, you should be objective and unbiased as we listen and score today, and we know you all are, but we just remind ourselves of that because it is really tough at times. But we will be unbiased in the way that we judge. And then for the students who are presenting, you know you have 10 minutes to speak, and at the 9-minute mark, I will hold up the 1-minute sign just to help you stay on track. But I know you all do very well. So with that, you all are ready? So let's begin. I'd like to please welcome Celeste Lugo, University of Arizona. That's me. I'm the timer. Yeah. I'll be right here. 9 minutes, and I'll give it to you. Wait, give me 1 second because I got to turn on the official timer.
I did not grow up in a democracy. I don't want you to imagine that I grew up in a place like Cuba or Russia, because I didn't. I grew up in Tucson. I moved there when I was 10 years old with typical Hispanic mother, overprotective and very strict. When my mom married my stepdad, Officer Wheeler, who retired from the Air Force, my house was run like a drill school. I was up at 600 every morning with hospital corners on my bed or else. And if I ever had the courage to complain, my parents loved to remind me that I did not live in a democracy. I lived in a Wheelerocracy, and they were in charge. Little did I know then that I would soon learn the importance of living in a true democracy where everyone's voice should be valued and heard. I'm gonna give you a little bit of information about my upbringing to give you some context. When I moved to Tucson in the summer of '97, I didn't speak English. And I was still excited to start school and make new friends. Mrs. Garcia was my 5th grade teacher, and on my first day of school, she sat me next to Eddie, who was a Spanish-speaking student, who would translate what she was saying as she was teaching. And this worked great for a few weeks, until one day, Eddie told me we were reading out loud in class that day. I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it, but I was determined to try. When my turn finally came, Eddie kicks me under the desk, and off I went. And it was a disaster. The sentence I was meant to read started with the word Friday, and I said Friday. And of course, everyone laughed. I left the classroom crying, and that was the day that Mrs. Garcia told me she was going to place me in a special class where I would learn how to speak English. As I walked home that day, I promised myself that I would master the language and I would excel at school so that no one would ever laugh at me again. And thankfully, I did. By the time I was in middle school, I was in the National Junior Honor Society and in the REACH program for gifted students. And by the time I was in high school, I had a 4.3 GPA out of a 4.0. I was an athlete, I was in student government, I did it all. My 5th grade self would have been so proud. I accomplished everything I said I would do. Things at school were great, and at home, they were no different. The Wheelers, we were your average middle-class family. We spent the weekends going camping or to my soccer tournaments. But of course, not everything was rainbows and butterflies. I was a teenager. And as a teenager, there were a lot of freedoms that I yearned for that I simply was not granted. My parents didn't let me work. They wanted me to focus on school. I wasn't allowed to drive or go on school trips because my parents feared for my safety. But I knew that my parents loved me and they cared for me and they gave me a lot. So I tried to not complain and really just make them proud. One day, my favorite high school teacher who knew that I had an interest in going to law school, told me he was going to nominate me for a scholarship that included a week-long trip to DC for students interested in pursuing law. Only 3 students from my high school would be nominated, and only 1 would win. But I knew my parents. So I suspected that if the nomination came from a teacher, they might consider letting me go. After all, I spent years following the rules of the Wheelerocracy, and I thought they would realize what an amazing opportunity this would be, and they would consider allowing me to go. After the nomination, I would come home every day after school and check the mail. March 16, 2005 is the day that I will never forget. I came home from school and I checked the mail. Nothing. I walked inside and found my parents sitting in the living room. My mom was holding a piece of paper in her hand. By the look of the stationery and the gold letters on it, I knew what it was about. I'd been here before, so I looked to my dad, hoping to catch his eye and plead with him. And my mom said the dreaded words, "We need to talk." But I was ready to make my case. Unfortunately, before I could even start with my argument, she said, "Honey, you can't go on this trip. I don't know how to say this, but you can't go on this trip because you're illegal." What? legal. The next hour of my life was a blur. My parents were in tears, trying to fill in details and trying to tell stories that made my strict upbringing make sense. In the moment, it didn't matter. Yeah, I wasn't allowed to work, not because my parents wanted me to focus on school, but because I didn't have a social security number that allowed me to do so. I wasn't allowed to drive or go on school trips, not because my parents feared for my safety, but because my parents were worried that I would be picked up at any moment and taken to a country that I hadn't been to since I was 10 years old. And honestly, in that moment, that didn't matter to me either. The only thing that mattered was that my entire life was a lie. Everything that I had known was not true. I wasn't American. I wasn't going to college. I wasn't going to have a future. I was illegal. And I didn't understand because I'd watched the nightly news with my dad and I saw a lot of storylines about illegals. And they didn't look like me. They didn't sound like me. And they didn't get straight A's and get scholarships. Didn't understand. The years between 2005 and 2012 were filled with disillusionment and me trying to gain a sense of self again. Who was I going to be now? Going to Mexico was not an option for me because I didn't have an attachment to the country. And as much as it filled me with shame to admit, I still considered myself an American, even though in reality, I had no voice this one. There were a lot of highs and lows as politicians like Senator McCain tried to bring light to the plight of the dreamers, as they like to call us, on TV. But it wasn't until 2012 when President Barack Obama, through executive action, signed the DACA bill. And that gave me a chance to dream again. By now, I knew the legal system well. I'd been volunteering at law firms, and I knew that executive action was not ideal. But hey, it was a way to get me to school. So I wasn't going to judge how I got there. December 2nd, 2012 is the second day that I will never forget. It was the day that I received my approval letter from the Department of Homeland Security. And along with it, my work authorization and my social security number. And those 9 digits that most people don't really give a second thought to, for me, was and still is one of the best days of my life. Those 9 digits meant that I could go to school. I immediately signed up for classes at Pima Community College, and I was working 2 jobs to pay for it. I didn't care. It took no time for me to start thinking about going to law school again. But I'm not a lawyer yet. So you know the story doesn't end there. Things were looking like they were on the up for me, but the Arizona Supreme Court had other things in store. You see, I do live in a democracy. And in a democracy where voting takes place, laws change. And in 2018, the Arizona Supreme Court voted to unanimously deny Dreamers in-state tuition, which meant that my schooling would go from something I could afford to something that was just going to be out of reach. This brings us to today. This is my story. It's just a story about a young woman who grew up believing she was American. Found out she wasn't, but in that process never lost love for this place and this country. I love living here, and I wouldn't trade living here for anywhere else. I hope that this November, while you are all exercising your democratic right to voice your opinion, you remember the story and you consider my voice as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. We'll give the judges 8 minutes to fill out their scorecard.
How are those faculty members so far? What do you think?
Things about the especially if it's a class where the subject is involved it's just good. The flexibility of the students working sports teams. So they like much appeals to their different kind of student. We have two master's degrees. One is the traditional thesis-oriented PhD. The other is an accelerated master's program that you actually begin while you're still in college. So early in your last year of undergrad or your first year. I have a few of those students in in-person class right now who are, they're simultaneously undergrads and grads. And then we have the PhD and we have a writer. Well, there's a minor. We also have
You all done?
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of watching you all. Okay. Our judges are done. So let me take a moment and get the judges all here. So once again, please welcome Rachel Hodges from the University of Arizona.
Before 2008, I didn't know what democracy was. Don't get me wrong, my teachers did well. They taught me that democracy was a form of government where you elect officials into office. This includes senators, governors, and even the President of the United States. And, of course, during every election, Nickelodeon would always play commercials in between SpongeBob and the Fairly Odd Parents, teaching children about democracy. Still, to this day, I remember the song Democracy in the USA, and it's been 20 years. But the thing is, democracy was an abstract concept. I couldn't see it, and I couldn't touch it. So how could I know what democracy was? That was until 2008 in October. My mother had brought me to the mall for a start of the year special. And as she was walking around, she saw an early voting center. and my mom loves to vote early. So she decided to cast her ballot. Only this time, she wanted me by her side. So she grabbed me by the arm and led me over to the early ballot center. And as she did, she went up to the busy poll workers and she said, "I'm here to vote. I have all of my documents and I want my daughter to be right by my side." The poll workers were ecstatic. Of course you can vote, and of course your daughter can be right next to you. After all, she's going to be a future voter. My mother collected her documents and went over to the ballot box. And for each name that she voted for, she pointed it out to me. She said, "This is who I'm voting for. This is why I'm voting for them. And this is why it's important." At the very end, before she sent out her ballot, she quickly looked to the left and she quickly looked to the right. And she went back to that first question. President of the United States. And she looked at me and she said, "Rachel, who would you vote for?" God, you're asking 11-year-old me to vote for the President of the United States? Oh my God. I quickly pointed to my mother's vote that was already highlighted. She nodded in approval, and she sent it out. Walking out of that mall with an "I voted" sticker, I felt 10 feet tall. After all, I had just voted for the President of the United States. Good God, I wanted to do it again. Of course, only problem was I was 11. There was no way an 11-year-old could vote again. I had to wait 7 years. But I didn't want to wait that long. I wanted to be a part of the process somehow. It took me a while, but eventually my 5th grade teacher handed out an assignment, a how-to essay. And at that moment, I had a light bulb. Why don't I write about democracy? Why don't I examine it, and why don't I investigate it? So I wrote a how-to essay on how to vote. In middle school, I wrote a persuasive essay about the importance of voting and why everyone should vote. And then when I reached high school, I joined the speech and debate team where in my congressional debates, I would write pieces of legislation that would allow easier access to the ballot box. And then, finally, after 7 years, I cast my first ballot with my mother right by my side. But I didn't want to stop writing about democracy. I had been doing it for so long. Why stop here? Especially since I just entered college and I had access to more research. And I decided to focus my efforts. I wrote about the costs incurred onto voters on election day. And I found that the majority of the costs actually occurred within the voting center because poll workers are often understaffed and they're undertrained, meaning that lines can be 10 to 30 minutes long as people are waiting to cast their ballots. And because they're undertrained, some ballots can be thrown out because of a mistake. And in each conclusion, as I found this out, I would always point to this problem and say, look, we need to find poll workers and we need to train them. And then I sent my essay off. It is so easy to point to a problem, yell a solution, and then just walk away. It's the easiest thing to do. But in 2020, I had to adapt and I had to change. In April of 2020,
COVID was raging. The most vulnerable of us all could die if they were infected. My own grandmother could die, my next door neighbor could die. It was a scary time. And that April, there was a special election in Tucson. And yet again, I was writing about democracy. But before I wrote my conclusion, I saw that I needed to cast my ballot. So I closed my laptop and I made my way down to St. Olga's Catholic Church, my voting center. As I pulled up, I saw long lines. It would take me 10 minutes to cast my ballot, but I knew I had time. And when I eventually entered into the gymnasium, I saw that indeed, this place had been understaffed, but also what caught my breath the most was that co-workers were the same age as my grandmother. If they caught COVID, they could die. And they were working in a polling station where people all over Tucson were gathering. I didn't know why they would do that. Didn't they know the risks they could die? So after I had filled out my ballot and I handed it off to the inspector, I asked why she was here. Why are you putting your life in danger? And she thought for a moment. She said, well, I know the risks, but this is democracy. If I'm not here, then people can't cast their ballot. And democracy doesn't work. I need to be here. The drive home was silent. And as I opened up my laptop and I saw the cursor blinking at me, inviting me in to write the same conclusion I always wrote, I just felt ashamed. Here I was, young, healthy, free time on my hands. I knew there was a problem. I knew a solution, and I was not being a part of it. If I cared so much about democracy, why wasn't I safeguarding it? Why wasn't I participating? So I closed my document, and I went to the Tucson Elections Department website and signed up to be a poll worker. Eventually, I was called in. And when I was assigned to be the Special Situations Clerk. This basically meant that if there was ever an issue with your ballot, I would try my damnedest to ensure that it was counted, it was filled out correctly, and that it was correct. I helped over 100 people in August and November. And in Tucson, that's just a small drop in a very large bucket. But in the late afternoon, a woman came in. She was carrying a baby in one hand and holding a 6-year-old's hand in another. I helped her with her ballot, and she went over to the ballot box. And as she was filling out her ballot, she pointed to each name. And she said, "This is the person I'm voting for. This is why their office is important. And this is why voting is essential." Thank you.